Only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's Simone from Jobs Australia. Just checking in, saying hello, letting you know that we're here if you've dialed in or you're online. We'll kick off properly in a couple more minutes because most people sort of start logging on right on the dot of the start of the meeting. So we'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. We've got 9 people or 10, 11 people who've joined so far. We're just waiting for a couple more. So if you could bear with us. Thank you. Hello everybody, it's Simone again. Thanks for your patience waiting for us to start. We're going to start properly now. Still probably a few people will join us a little bit late, but we'll commence proceedings anyway. Thank you for joining us for this, one of our regular Work for Dole network meetings. We run it as a teleconference and a webinar, and it's really just an opportunity for us to report the information that we've gathered in the various forums that we provide representation on to our network of Work for Dole providers, who include hosts, Work for Dole coordinators and JOBACTIVE providers. So we aim to give a fairly 360-degree perspective of the Work for Dole arrangements, including a report back from what we know has been happening at the Department of Employment. So again, thank you for joining, and I'm here with my colleagues Janet Chimonyo and Lance Wilson from the policy team, and Alan Sally from the admin support area are looking at the IT issues. They'll be helping out if we get caught out with any of the technical stuff, and Al's just going to take you through a couple of slides now on how to engage with us during the webinar.
Hi everyone. So I just wanted to quickly run through how you can sort of engage and ask questions and contribute in this webinar. On the slide in front of you, you should see a dashboard similar to the one that's also on the right of your screen. It has a virtual hand which you can click on at any time. If you raise it, what we'll do is unmute you so you can ask the question verbally. I believe Simone will be stopping at a few points for questions to be asked, but that's not to say that if there's anything you do want to chime in on, just click on that hand symbol and feel free to jump in at any point. The microphone icon as well, you guys will see a line through yours because we have you all muted. The reason we do that is because there can be sort of a bit of background sound issues, so when we have everyone unmuted it can sometimes cause an issue. But what we'll do over time is slowly unmute more and more people, particularly when we get to the end when there are questions, and see if we can make it a bit more conversational. For those, everyone seems to be fine in terms of audio. If you're sitting in front of your computer and you're on telephone, you need to make sure that you enter the 2 or 3 digit audio pin. Whereas if you're using microphone or speaker, you don't need that. Either way, if you click on the audio tab, it will give you instructions on how to use either one. And with that said, I'll pass it back to Simone.
Okay, thanks Al. So as Al said, I will stop at certain moments to see if you have any feedback, and that means I'll need you to wave your hand so we know that you want to make a comment. But if you miss the opportunity to ask a question or contribute something that you want to say in the meeting, please contact us later. There's also a short survey right at the end of the webinar where you can leave your contact details, and we'll get back in touch with you if we haven't been able to respond to any questions that you have. So I'm just going to quickly move through some recent information that we have from the various groups that we provide representation on, and the main one of those is the Department of Employment Working Group for Work for All. There's also been a couple of meetings of guideline working groups as well, which I'll refer to because both of these groups have resulted in the review of the expenditure guide, which I'll talk about in a minute. I just wanted to give you some feedback on what were the main issues that were discussed at the last Department of Employment Working Group. Certainly the expenditure guide, a new version will be published in the next few days and sent to peak bodies for comment. And the expenditure guide is very critical to the acquittal process for all group-based activities, and that means that we'll have a much better guide to work to with the acquittal of the existing round of activities which are expiring now, and a much better template to use for all future work for all budgeting and acquittal processes. So we're looking forward to seeing that. There's been quite a lot of opportunity to comment and make changes on that on the way through. One thing I would say in terms of some new areas that have been addressed by the department in the review of the expenditure guide is they're now very much referring to the JOBACTIVE evidentiary guides, or the guide that the JOBACTIVE providers use to provide evidence of claims for the various monetary payments that they receive. So now the expenditure guide clearly reflects the evidentiary requirements guide, and that's useful in a sense that it's much clearer what kind of evidence of expenditure is required, but it also does mean that it is very prescriptive in terms of the kinds of evidence that can be supplied. So I don't think the story about acquittals and evidence of expenditure is quite over yet, but we'll wait till we see the latest version of the guide and give you an opportunity to provide some feedback with us to the department. So I spoke to Stephanie Bennett from the department just before, and she told me that would be with the peak bodies in the next few days. And along with that would also be an updated, or actually this is a completely new guide for hosts. And this will be a kind of, what the host side activities in providing work for all activities would look like. I haven't seen a copy of it yet, so I don't know exactly what will be in it. I suspect there'll be quite a few sort of prescriptive requirements, especially around the conducting of the risk assessments. And they're also publishing an updated template for the host agreement, which will include more clauses for making explicit arrangements regarding payments especially, but potentially some other things as well. So we're looking forward to seeing those so that we can provide some in-depth analysis on those. I will speak about both these things a bit later. I just want to quickly run through the rest of the working group agenda items from the recent meeting. We spoke a little bit about where we're up to in terms of a structural review of work for all arrangements. I think they called an election so that they wouldn't have to actually look at making any structural changes to work for all. I think it all just got too hard. So basically that means the department are in caretaker mode and they are not able to address the design of any policy program arrangements during the period in which they're in caretaker mode while they wait to brief the incoming government. So in terms of any structural review to the design of work for all arrangements, they're on hold till after Saturday, and we don't know to what extent the department will then have an appetite for undertaking any further structural review after that. Janet wants to make a comment here.
Simone, I just wanted to ask, because I think people online would be interested, given that you and Lance have been sitting in on the working group meetings for the last several months, what's your sense about the department's feeling or appetite for the review? I understand that we all are aware that in caretaker mode the department will be fairly close-lipped, tight-lipped, But do you have a feeling that they are thinking seriously about structural reviews and changes, and that they have any plans in terms of those?
Well, I'll make a comment and then I might ask Lance to speak, because Lance has probably been closest to any discussion about this. But my understanding was that before the election was called, there was some discussion about the lead provider role being transferred to the work for all coordinators, and there was certain resistance to that idea from some job active providers. And the last I heard, they were saying this may be a solution to the problem, but we need to explore the implications in more detail, and also how to satisfy that desire of job active providers to maintain their own arrangements for work for all. So it didn't actually provide any insight to me in terms of whether there was actually any structural review being formally considered. But I'll ask Lance to comment on that, because he probably knows.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. I think so. Part of it kind of changed a little bit when the budget was released, and there was some measures in there, particularly the around that Youth Job Path program or the internships program. One of the features of that was that basically it shifted work for the dole requirements for Stream A's out to 12 months rather than 6. And that reduces the overall number of work for the dole places that are required in the whole system. So I think initially they were talking about 150,000 per year, and I think we were told that it would reduce by about a third as a result of that change. And that led Martin Hare to say at the Job Active forum that was at the airport at Melbourne Airport just after the budget, he sort of raised a question about whether you need the whole lead provider arrangement, given that lead provider was about trying to meet the demand for all of these places, and they thought there would be a massive amount of pressure for defined places, and now they've changed the settings, and that means that there's reduced demand for places. So that conversation didn't get very far before the election was announced. Obviously, they announced the election pretty much the next week. So I think that's one of the things that basically needs to be revisited as soon as the election's done. Yeah.
Thanks, Lance. Now, for anyone who's sitting out there who's not a job active or a work for dole coordinator who doesn't understand this sort of background information and the implications for hosts, please feel free to drop me a line after the meeting and I can explain it, because I can imagine that it sounds like gobbledygook to some of you. Now, the other thing that was discussed a little bit at the meeting was that the place fees would be paid directly to the lead provider, so that there would be no invoicing between the lead and the non-lead, and this was only for the $100 part of the payment. So that was to simplify invoicing arrangements between providers for the withheld $100 part of the payment that was for the non-lead provider, which confusing. And also the guideline review, we're expecting to see updated guidelines fairly soon, and in the guideline review meetings we actually talked about the clarity of the guidelines and how easy they were for the different audiences to understand and wade through to get to the critical information that they needed or that made sense in their context. We're yet to see what has come out of the guideline review. I know there's been some work on aligning the various guidelines, especially the expenditure guide and the work for dole guidelines. And the only other thing I wanted to report about the working group was there's been a contract variation for the job active providers, which has included some provisions for changes for work for dole, especially associated with risk management. And a clause has been inserted in the contract variation which provides a requirement for the hosts to notify the lead provider if there has been any change in the nature of the activity that is being undertaken during the activity. And I think this is a response to some of the issues that were raised around risk assessments and the currency of the information in the risk assessments that was discussed during the guideline review. And the department are basically, I think they're just trying to make sure that if a job seeker has been assigned to, you know, undertake a certain activity, like for example, that has certain safety implications, that if the nature of the activity has changed significantly, that the new risks to that job seeker have been handled correctly. But that one I think needs a little bit of unpacking in terms of how that will be managed in the guidelines and the guidance that's provided to hosts. But just one to watch out for. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So in terms of my understanding of things that have been going on, work for all, I just tried to summarise the big three issues, but I couldn't keep it to three. So the big six, anyway, relate to being at forecasting and planning national and local level predictions of job seeker flow and demand for places, acquittals, I don't want to talk about those anymore, the host agreement, and lead provided, and I've said trends, and what I really mean is, you know, what we hear is the reluctance in some cases of all job active providers to assume their fair share, or whatever's considered a fair share of the lead provider role. And still, I think some questions about group activities versus individual activities, and then another issue around job seeker attendance. So that's just a summary. Now I can see someone's asked a question here. So, okay, that's right. Yep, we will, at the end of the teleconference, we've got our contact details on the slide, so we'll get back to you if you ask us questions after the meeting. All right. Moving on to the next slide. Before I do, does anybody have any comments on any of those issues that I've raised? Can just you put your hand up if you want to ask a question or make a comment now, otherwise I'll move on. There'll be more chances to speak a bit later. Okay, so I guess the biggest one that everyone's looking at the moment, considering the next round of group-based activities, has been in negotiation over the last month or so, is about the predictive data for the volume of job seekers who will be in work for all activities from the 1st of July. And I've had some reports from coordinators that the scale of job seekers who are predicted to go into work for all is very similar to the first wave, i.e. the 1st of July 2015. I've heard there's some variation around the country about the numbers who are going back in, but it looks like we've got a pretty big wave coming up again for this wave of work for all activities. Now there has been some variation in the direction that job active providers have been given in terms of what activities they refer them to. So there's no reliable information about the number of people who are who have an annual activity requirement, which is the phase that they're in their job active service. That means that they might go into work for all. But we have heard a figure that was a point-in-time figure provided by the department that about 18% of job seekers who had an AAR were going into work for all. That was a point-in-time figure that Martin Hare provided at a forum earlier on. And I've heard quite a few people using that as a benchmark for what might happen this time round. So around 18-20%. And in this round, there's a much higher expectation that the division of activities between group and individual places will be split between 30% group and 70% individual activities. That wasn't the case in the first round. I think they'll be sticking much tighter to that this time round. Also, the job active own source places versus work for all coordinator source places. It's about 50% each nationally. In some areas there are more places sourced and taken up through the work for all coordinator than in others, but across the country there's a lot of variation in the number of places that are sourced by the job active providers directly versus those that are brokered by the work for dole coordinator, and that causes some concerns in some ways in some regions. And we've also learned that the leads own 85% of their own places, and that only 15% are shared with other providers. So it means that there's a lot of exclusive arrangements between JobActive providers and hosts in terms of the provision of work for dole activities. So there's some sort of useful information about patterns there. Now, hosts often ask me, how do I find out, whether there's going to be a demand for activity in my area? And I've been given information by the work for dole coordinators that they should be working with the work for dole coordinators who have the best bird's eye view of what's happening in an employment region and what the demand is likely to be, and that they're collecting information about demand from all the JobActive providers. But I do also know it has been quite effective for some hosts to have entered into direct relationships with some lead providers for the supply of their activities. So anyway, that's just a report on some of the things that are happening in terms of the scale. Janet just wants to make a comment.
I'm just making a general comment. We are coming up to the first anniversary for JobActive, and for a lot of people online thinking back to the RFT and the figures given in the RFT, the standout pattern, I suppose, for most of those various ways of cutting the data is a significant drop from what providers or tenderers were led to expect. So there are far few work for the dole places needed than we anticipated when people were tendering. I think when the program started, although it was clear at the outset that group activities were going to be for Stream C, they were spread a little differently, and the department's been tightening up on that, so that's changed. So overall there has been a steady decline, and the change that Lance referred to before indicates additional policy changes which reduce the demand. So I think my reading, I don't know what yours is, Simone, my reading is that we're not going to see more demand. We're either going to see, perhaps it will stabilise, or if there are further policy changes it may fall away even further. And 20% of the overall demand, I don't remember the figure in the RFT, but it's significantly lower than the original figure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which means, and this won't be news to anyone out there, but for a lot of people there are a lot of operational costs and setup costs that they now have much less need for.
Yeah. So I think it's been very challenging for hosts in particular to do their business planning not knowing the scale of activities or the number of places that might be available. We've pushed the department a few times for data. I spoke to Stephanie, as I said before, and she said they're providing some information to the coordinators in the next few days. But again, it's not something that necessarily gets passed on to the host. So really, if you're a host, the best thing you can do is to speak to maintain close contact with your coordinators, and also work on your relationship development with the JobActive providers, because it does take a lead provider for your activity to get off the ground, basically. So you've got a couple of relationships to work on there. There's a question here about work for dole places in TTW. I was going to mention this a bit later, so I did want to kind of check what people's experience had been of the level of demand for work for dole places now that TTW had started. I hadn't heard anything about that. May, you've asked the question. If you want to make a comment, you can speak now. We've unmuted you.
Is my microphone working? I don't know.
You're speaking. We can hear you now.
Okay. No, I don't. That question's not coming from anywhere. I was just interested to see, and
yep.
It's fascinating to hear about the trends and patterns in demand for places. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. So,
no, it was just a question.
Yeah, it's something we're monitoring. At this stage, we haven't really had any feedback about the number of the job seekers who are in TTW who are young job seekers who have been identified from the JOBACTIVE caseload who are now going into a youth-focused activity. And I'm just keeping an eye on that because Work for Dole is an activity that TTW providers can, a pathway that TTW providers can use for their young participants. And I have said to host providers previously, find out who your local TTW providers are because they could well be a source of future activities for you. And there is a list of TTW providers on the Department of Employment website. And I'll, after this meeting, when I put these slides up onto our website, I'll put a link to that's the source of that information as well. So that will be if you're looking at providing activities to the youth cohort. So in terms of the next wave of job seekers, I thought it was quite useful to revisit the number of job seekers that had commenced in Work for Dole at the 1st of July last year, because this is the second wave that we're experiencing now. As I said before, some of them are returning to Work for Dole, so it means that they haven't exited employment services or social security over the last 12 months. And in some employment regions, I've heard that the figures for the job seekers who are in this sort of repeat wave are similar to the first wave. So that means a lot of people have remained unemployed. But there is also, and that's sort of all the job seekers who commenced in that period who are now at their 12-month anniversary where they're required to do their Work for Dole or their annual activity. But I know there's been some variation around the country, but this is the closest I could get to having any idea at a national level how many job seekers might be going into Work for Dole. And I have provided a table that breaks them down by stream because roughly only those in Stream C are intended to go into group-based activities. But again, this national level data really doesn't tell you anything about what's going on at your local level or what the demand at your local level is or what your JOBACTIVE trends in terms of referring people to Work for Dole are. So it's really just there at a sort of high level for understanding, but your local level relationships are where you're going to get the best information about demand for activities. The expenditure guide, which you're all waiting for the acquittals of the existing activities that are expiring now, the latest version is in the Department of Employment Work for Dole guidelines, but the new version will be available very soon. And I've asked the department as soon as we get it if we can circulate it, because I actually think it provides some really useful templates for putting budgets together and budgets that can be acquitted for the purpose of completing the payments for the activities rather than budgets and acquittal processes that don't align. And I would warn you that the expenditure guide does mention the need to keep receipts, and that was a bugbear in the previous rounds of acquittals. I'm pretty sure there will continue to be a requirement for receipts of expenditure on things like, you know, buying wood or nails or anything relating to an activity. They will need to be kept. Okay, so just in terms of the host agreement, we expect to see some new sections, particularly around clarifying the payment arrangements. It will probably include some examples that won't be prescriptive. The examples will be things like, you know, the arrangement to pay a certain amount of the group-based activity fee upfront, and then a certain point at a milestone on completion of some agreed part of the activity, and then a process for the final payment. Now, I know that a lot of hosts have experienced frustration in payments being withheld to them, and that was partly because there wasn't really any clarity in the original host agreement about how payments would be acquitted. So whatever the department puts into the new host agreement template will be negotiable, and I can't stress enough to hosts that you need to negotiate terms that are acceptable to your organisation. It's been, I think, really sad that a lot of hosts have had to wear cash flow issues in the receipt of payments because there hasn't been enough upfront agreement about how the payments would be made. So I urge you very strongly to make sure that the host agreement reflects your needs and your terms as well as the job active provider terms, because it has been quite an asymmetrical relationship in terms of the extent to which you have been able to negotiate the terms of that. Job active providers are running their host agreements through their legal departments. They are looking very closely at their contractual requirements, the department, and passing on requirements to hosts in the host agreements. And some of that I think is unavoidable and necessary for the job active providers to do. But I think you also as hosts need to negotiate back some of your own terms, and that especially around payments and especially around some provisions for selectivity of participants or any other levels of selection that you want to include. Now, I mentioned before the department's publishing a guide for hosts, and I expect some of those things will be covered in that guide, but as I said, we're yet to see it yet, and I hope to see it soon. So I've got a couple of questions coming up right now, and I'm just going to have a quick look at them and see if you would like to speak, either of you who are asking questions, wave your hand on the panel, but otherwise we'll take these and do them later, respond to them later. Well, Janelle first then.
Hi, Janelle. We might unmute you if that's okay, and you can ask your question verbally. Go ahead.
Okay, Janelle, I'll just read out your question. You asked host agreements. Sorry, I'll repeat that. I said, Janelle, you asked how hosts are able to determine the payments when the Department of Employment has taken some time to approve acquittals. So a lot of the payments to hosts have been withheld because there's been complexity at the acquittal process with the Department of Employment, and the job active provider has not passed on the full payment to the host because of fear that they may not receive the full amount of money from the department, and that there's been some querying about the expenditure, or they haven't reported it correctly. But I strongly urge you as hosts to look at the agreement as your contract for the supply of the services for work for all on your terms, and to make sure that the payments, the cycle for the payments is, the schedule for the payments is documented clearly in the host agreement. The complexity that the job active provider has in completing that payment is between the job active provider and the department. If you have a contract with the lead provider to provide services and pay you according to a certain schedule, according to agreed milestones, then that's a contractual arrangement between you and them. Now, I'm hoping that the expenditure guide is going to clear up a lot of all the frustration that there has been about what documentary evidence, what kind of receipts, what kind of evidence of payrolls, all of the kind of things that have caused frustration in getting payments through. And especially if you have an agreed schedule for payments in the future, you can prevent the payment from being withheld because you have a contractual agreement for things to be done in a certain way. Now, I've got another question here from John. John, I'll take your question on notice. I'll have a look at the latest version of the expenditure guide and give you some feedback on what it says here. The question is about using evidence from expenditure on debit or credit cards as evidence of expenditure against an activity. And from memory, what I've seen in the expenditure guide is that they've said that the whatever form of receipt it is, it needs to clearly specify what the purchase was for. So if it's just a credit card statement and it says, $500 at Bunnings, that wouldn't be sufficient. You would need to have an itemised list of everything that was bought at Bunnings. But if you can get back to us later, John, we'll talk to you about your specific query and see if we can clarify any of that, because I know this is all going to start hitting everybody again very soon with the second round of acquittals looming, and I'm hoping the department's guide helps to sort out a lot of the issues that there were. Okay, so I'm moving now to a section where I get a report from each of the stakeholder groups in the work for dole arrangements. I'm starting with JOBACTIVE, and then I'll move to the coordinators, and then I'll move to the hosts. And so that you don't all die of boredom of my voice, I've asked some other people to speak here. So I'm going to turn over to Narelle Caulfield. Narelle, are you on the line there? So Narelle's another one of who can't escape work for dole no matter how hard she tries. Who's back assuming the responsibility for work for dole arrangements at the Salvation Army Employment Plus. Hi Narelle, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you, Simone. Yeah, it's been a long history, and I've come in and out, and I'm coming back in just to relieve somebody for annual leave at the moment. But I can give you an overview of some of the challenges and updates from a provider point of view. I guess we are the third largest provider of JOBACTIVE across Australia, so we have varying, I guess, range of experiences from really small, more regional type regions or locations through to metropolitan in the major cities. So, look, I think I would speak for most JOBACTIVEs, if not all, that the acquittal process has been very complicated, very problematic and frustrating on everybody's account. I think the frustration has been caused in part by not having the expenditure guidelines until December, as I understand it. I was out of the role at that time, but I knew that we were waiting and waiting when I exited in November. So I think that has sort of made things a whole lot more complicated, particularly for hosts that hadn't been involved in work for the dole, previously or had a long history. So I know the level of evidence required is difficult for many hosts. We are getting regular requests from the department for full documentary evidence on a range of activities. So it's a random sample of activities that have completed and gone through to the acquittal stage. And I've been back in this role for, this is my third day, and I've had multiple requests from different states. So it's a part of the ongoing monitoring of work for the dole and risk management for the department. And so we obviously then have to pass that on and seek full receipts and invoices and documentary evidence for every expenditure item for that activity. So I guess in many cases we have that from our hosts, and many put a lot of work into finding the bits of paper in the shoebox that link up to the line item within the budget, and I know that a lot of time and effort goes into that. And likewise, we have to then go through and reconcile all of that for our internal processes, for our finance team and executive team to sign off on acquittals. So just, I guess, so you're aware that's the level of evidence that the department are requiring of us. It's not of every single activity, but there is a large number of requests coming through at this stage. So in my 2.5 days back in this role, I've had at least 5, probably 8 to 10 requests either coming in new or that I needed to sort of finalise and send back out.
Yeah.
I guess, sorry.
That's okay, I was just letting you know we're still listening. You can keep going.
Okay, great. Look, I guess for us moving forward, the level of scrutiny around group-based activities remains, and I guess that's to mitigate the risk for all parties involved around, acquittals and I guess the amount of money that's being invested by the department, acknowledging there's a huge investment of varying kinds from hosts. for group activities. And so we're wanting to make sure that we've got everything clear and understood in the beginning. Is there value for money for the department's point of view? Is there going to be, enough of a tangible output to justify, the total cost and the benefit to the job seekers, what's going to prepare them. So I've sort of been given the task from our executives that we still need to maintain a really close scrutiny of group-based activities that are proposed to us from our team or from a Work for the Dole coordinator. And that's, I guess, recognising the challenges around acquittals as well as the high dollar amounts that are involved in group activities.
Yeah.
We have had some issues. We've got, there's a tray on my desk where there's some issues in regards to a lack of evidence or some other problems around group activities in particular. So for us as an organisation, we need to maintain a sort of a high level of risk mitigation and ensuring that it doesn't go pear-shaped for anybody, for the host, for ourselves, for the job seekers and certainly for the department.
Yeah. Now,
the resources, sorry, you go.
I was going to just say, Narelle, from your point of view in terms of the flow of job seekers into Work for Dole for the next round of activities, what does the scale look like compared to the first 2 rounds? Apologies if you were going to get to that. Sounds like you had a structured report already.
No, that's okay. I haven't had a chance to have a detailed look at the next wave. My understanding is that it is similar to the previous wave, perhaps a little less. I guess there's a couple of factors. The first is, if we look back 12 months, Work for the Dole was, in a sense, considered the default activity. If you weren't doing part-time paid work for 15 or 25 hours, then you were in Work for the Dole. And over the past 12 months, there has been I'll say a softening of that approach, and so job seekers are now more able, or providers are now more able to have job seekers undertaking other approved activities. So instead of having, 20% of our caseload in Work for the Dole, it's perhaps dropped, I think, nationally more around the 15% mark. And I think that might perhaps gain a little bit more momentum. I think certainly for large organisations like ours, it's like turning the Queen Mary when you're trying to sort of adopt a policy change or implement sort of changes to policy because of the size of our operation. And I think, I guess people on the ground delivering services to job seekers at site might sort of take some time in I guess, evaluating other options alternative to Work for the Dole. So I'd anticipate probably another slight easing of the volume of job seekers into Work for the Dole. On top of that is the estimated 30% decrease in demand, if you like, for places given the 1 October change.
Yeah.
That change is will impact directly on Stream A's. Now, technically, I think they're supposed to only be in individual activities, and our experience is that there's a small number in group-based activities also. Some of those might be given the, for remote or very regional areas, and there's only a limited number of activities available. So we anticipate a reduction in need for supply of individual places across the board, possibly a small decline in group-based places, although we'll still need to maintain that ratio of the 70-30. Agree with you that the department will probably keep pushing that agenda.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. One final point, unless there's any other questions. The amount of resources that we as an organisation and many job actives put into Work for the Dole is absolutely enormous. We've got teams, who are processing, timesheets and attendance and all of that. We've got a team here at National Office, albeit a small one, that are responsible for the startup of projects and the documentation and the approval process. Then our finance department, there's a small team there that process just the payments to hosts and the acquittals and that sort of thing. So, and then we have obviously our field staff, our work for the dole advisors in each of the regions, as well as the JOBACTIVE staff on the ground who are referring job seekers into activities, and they have to record that into the system. So it's a huge operation that covers many that has many touch points and different teams responsible for the different elements, and thereby it's quite a difficult logistical and managerial, I guess, exercise for us. It's a complex program. The program itself isn't funded for JOBACTIVE providers, so there's not a substantial work for the dole processing fee, so providers aren't reimbursed or paid to perform that function. It's rather seen as an element of the JOBACTIVE contract that's delivered. So don't always get it right. I think it's quite complex, and we'd be keen to see some improvements and efficiencies and reduction in administration and processing. That's something that I think all providers have expressed is a significant drain on our resources, which prevents, I guess, which utilises resources that otherwise might be channeled into getting job seekers into paid work. So I guess they're the challenges from our point of view.
Yeah.
Although I feel a bit of a fraud speaking to that, only 3 days back in the job, but I've remained within the organisation.
Work for dole's in your blood now, Narelle. No escape.
It is. I started in 2004, so it's been a long journey.
Well, thank you for that. That was a great report. We'll move on now because we're starting to run out of time onto our report from the Work for Dole coordinator. And I hope we have Tony on the line. We've just unmuted you, Tony,
yep.
And we can hear you.
Okay. Great. Okay. Yeah, Tony Blackman Thursday. We're Work for Dole coordinator in 3 regions, 2 in New South Wales, 1 in the Gold Coast. In Queensland for about 3,000 places per year that we source. I guess our primary focus the last couple of months has been one on monitoring, carrying out monitoring visits to hosts, getting their feedback, and we do formal feedback sessions with them. By far the biggest issue there has been lack of job seekers, and certainly the biggest issue besides structural issues with Work for Dole. That's largely been because of a number of things. One is that targets from the department generally aren't very accurate. Retained positions tie up a lot of places. Centrelink aren't always forthcoming in enforcing PRs, and I guess there's more AAR activity options around now. So all those have impacted on the number of job seekers actually out there. The other focus we've had is securing places for July, August for the wave coming through. Then we're looking at probably about a 35% reduction in places on the previous wave, which actually ends up roughly about the same as what the first wave was back in May to July last year. So we have set our own targets. We know the department will bring out some indication, but we've based that on AAR flows that we know are coming through from the departmental reports, and at this stage looking probably about 20% of those as a maximum going into Work for the Dole, as well as accounting for a drop-off from Stream A's later in the period. Most activity is going to be in the July-August period, with only a small bit after October anyway, so it will have a fairly small impact overall this performance period. In terms, I know everyone has issues with acquittals, but we certainly included in our information that we give to hosts. Again, like Narelle said, we tell them put everything in a shoebox. Every receipt you spend and gain, you need to put in the shoebox. And certainly, because we're reducing numbers this time, we're not reapproving people who have had difficulty in acquitting satisfactorily or haven't kept records, as well as those who are not on the supervisor app also, because it saves a lot of time. there has been some reluctance for some providers to be leads, but generally we don't have too much issues in that way, and we've looked at locking down places for lead providers rather than having to share them too much as one tactic that way. But certainly I can see why people would be reluctant to be leads. There are financial risks involved, certain acquittal issues, etc. So I guess that's where we are in terms of work with all coordinators at the moment, looking at a reduction for the next 6 months.
Thanks, Tony. So we're looking at a bump, and then we're looking at a kind of reduction in the flow of job seekers after the next bump. Just, Tony, I'm very interested in the way that you've been able to get everybody in your employment regions to cooperate and take on the lead provider roles. Is it like a coordinator mafioso or something that you have out there to make them do it, or what do you think has made the difference in your employment regions?
I just think you involve them. Like we're a job active ourselves, so you've got to be very transparent and have different lines of accountability and so on, but very much just involving everyone in the joint decision making. So any major projects and so on, we run them past our work with the whole group that meets every month. We just don't go ahead with projects without their say so. Same with costings for individual placements and so on. So I think it's a lot of consultation, joint decision making and so on, rather than just dictating to them. So and that seems to work for us. 95% of our places, we get 95%, if not more, of the places in the area. Providers don't have to go and get places at all. Yeah, and when we were talking that's where we are.
What I thought the benefit really of having all the places go through the Work for All coordinator is that you had taken out a great deal of admin for the lead providers, so that once their signature hit the host agreement, you had really done the majority of the work before that stage, rather than them having to negotiate all of those things themselves.
Exactly, so yeah, we negotiate detailed proposals and budgets, and do a lot of monitoring also, which saves the job active. So I guess it's just easier for them to go through us.
Yeah. Okay.
But then I've realised that in other regions it's not run that way, so it's a different case.
Yeah. And that comes back to some of the structural issues about the architecture of the Work for All arrangements that we will continue to investigate and advocate for once the election is over. Thanks for that report, Tony. I'm going to move on to hosts because we're running out of time. Before I get into the host bit proper, I have a couple of hosts lined up to make some comments about their experiences. But I've also had a couple of questions from John Bayliss, and I just wondered whether you wanted to, there's a few things that you've asked in your questions, John, that are kind of statements about the arrangements for Work for All, which we are conscious of the incredibly acute workload that has been associated with being a Work for All host, and also for all the other parties, as you've just been hearing on the phone, how incredibly complex and frustrating that has been. So certainly agree with the comments that you've made. You also asked if there was a formal process for resolving disputes. That's a fantastic question. I haven't seen anything from the department yet about that. When they update the host guide, or when they produce the host guide, we'll check that. But a few of you would have received information from me following the Work for All forum that we had in April, where I'd raised at the Department of Employment, what do hosts do if they continue to be in conflict or in dispute with their job active provider about acquittal processes? And I was told by the department that hosts would be authorised in those circumstances that they had escalated their issues to the job active provider's management already, that they would be authorised to escalate them to the state office of the Department of Employment for their employment region. And that list of state office contacts is available on the government directory. It's also available on a link that I provided on one of our web postings. So after this teleconference, I'll post that link into the notes that I make when I put this up on our website. John, was there anything else that you wanted to say just quickly before I move on to some of the other hosts who want to comment on things. We've just unmuted you quickly.
Go ahead, John.
Yes, thanks, Simone and Lance, and I'm really privileged to hear the work that's been done by the JobActive providers, which clearly is a fantastic piece of work. You know, my strong observation is that we are currently still working with an acquittal process, and that's not only for host organisations like ourselves at RedLink Australia, but also many JobActive providers where the acquittal process and the cost of actually servicing and managing that acquittal process certainly seems to be disproportionately high to the relative budget for each of the projects. And I can certainly empathise with many of the JobActive providers who are dealing with hundreds of group program budgets. And I really believe there ought to be a stronger position put by JobActive providers and hosts back to the department to seek a more streamlined approach, and particularly at a time right now, of course we're in an election mode. The climate of discussion is about cost containment in an environment where there is cost escalation in some areas, and I'm not really convinced at the moment that we have got the right sort of metrics, particularly in the context of the level of detail acquittal processes and the costs to hosts. That includes not only completing the end of term acquittal for each project, but also the requirement to provide periodic acquittals. To me, it just makes absolutely no sense when we're dealing in relative terms, relative to the other budgets that an organisation like RedLink is managing with the federal government or other governments. It just seems absolutely unusual that the Department of Employment should be putting so much costs back of house when it should be freeing up those dollars to do other things within the work, the wider work for the dole and the Department of Employment programs.
I think there'll be cheers of agreement, support going on there out in the background. John, you're absolutely right. It has been a major concern for everybody involved in these arrangements. And there certainly are a lot of unresolved issues that we will continue to pursue with the department. I'll have a chat with you after this meeting about some of the things that you've raised in those comments. I hope, if you don't mind, we move on now, because I had a couple of other hosts that I have arranged to make comments before we finish the meeting, and I'll try and get us finished on the dot. So Anne-Marie from Skills Centred in Queensland, could you provide us with a quick report on what's been happening for you guys up there?
Anne-Marie from Skills Centred. We are a small not-for-profit that assists other community-based organisations, and we run a lot of group activities. We're down to our last group activity for the 12-month period. We have 7 group activity proposals sitting with the Work for the Dole coordinator, who we work very closely with in this employment region, and we can't get anyone to go lead provider. Our group activity lowest employment outcome was 9 people employed for the 26-week period. And our current activity, which finishes on the 8th of July, has already had employment outcomes to 16 during that 26-week period.
Yeah, and that's just tragic, Anne-Marie. You told me about this before, and I felt really sad that an organisation that has massive capability in providing very work-orientated and useful activities has experienced so much frustration in getting those activities off the ground. And you mentioned that you have organised a meeting with the State Department to kind of pursue some of those. So in terms of strategies that hosts might engage in to resolve some of these issues, that's certainly one way that they can be escalated when things reach the very dire situation that you've just reported. So thanks for that report, Anne-Marie. I've got one other from WA. I just wanted to get a little bit of a talk about from Lorraine Whale at Bridging the Gap in WA. Can you tell us how things are going over in WA, Lorraine?
Yes, hi Simone. Things are going great over in WA. We are a very small non-for-profit community organisation as well. We actually have 22 employees in our organisation. In the first wave of Work for the Dole group activities, we actually had 10 very successful activities. Employment was huge out of the activities. Obviously, as agreeing with John and a number of other speakers, Simone, the acquittal process has been an absolute nightmare. We are fortunate in the fact that we have kept very, very good records with receipts and evidence. What we found our problem to be was actual individual providers not being as good with their admin and losing records, thus us having to re-provide evidence over and over and over, which has been very disappointing. Okay. However, the good side of that is that we learned from the first wave, and we established a fantastic relationship with our Work for the Dole coordinator over here, and we currently are running 9 Work for the Dole activities through the coordinator. And it's since we've been with the Work for the Dole coordinator, it has been smooth running. We have found that all of our activities have been full with participants. They're very like-minded with their upkeep of evidence. So like I said, we've learned from the first round, and what I would suggest to hosts is that, and this mightn't be what people want to hear, Simone, but I would say go through your Work for the Dole coordinator because it's a very smooth running process.
Okay, that's really good, and what I'm hoping to do is establish an area on the Jobs Australia website where we can, for collaboration, where we can share our experiences on what works and, you know, even possibly some templates on practice and procedures that transfer from organisations to organisation. Now, I'm conscious that we've run out of time and that, that a lot of you have probably got other things that you need to get on with. So I'm just quickly going to skip through the next slides, and thanks for that report, Lorraine. Great to hear from you over in WA. I did the Work for Dole Big 3, which is not 3, and these are the issues that require further work, and I think we've covered those in this meeting. And as I say, if you have any, we've got a link on our website to some of the data for the wave until the end of December 2015 of all of the volume of job seekers that participated in Work for Dole during that period. That was released at the Centre estimates in February. And also the next slide, just the resources, is the Work for Dole guidelines, which has the last version of the expenditure guide embedded in the Work for Dole guidelines. So I think that's now up to about 570 pages, that guideline. That was a joke, sorry. And there's a new guide due out quite soon. And at the last slide is the email addresses for me and my colleagues in the policy team who do work on Work for Dole related matters. And as we exit and say goodbye, if I can't see any urgent hands waving, I'll let you go off the line. There's a short survey you can undertake and leave your details if you want us to get back in touch with you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Bye, everybody.